we have a 10-minute conversation with Justin Tagg on how NFTs and blockchain are changing the narrative game. So can I please welcome Justin to the stage? Thank you.
It's a very exciting thing to arrive on stage and realize that the time is already ticking down. I'm already 30 seconds into my talk, so I'm going to get started. I want to start by saying, first of all, my name's Justin. I'm also known as Devoid on Twitter, as a poet and an artist. And my main focus is storytelling. I love storytelling. I'm going to start with a question. When was the last time you told a story? That is a rhetorical question, because I now only have 9 minutes and 10 seconds left. But the answer is that constantly, all the time, we're always telling stories. Story is a kind of software. It is life's operating system to allow it to update the mental models that we have for understanding the world around us and our place within it on the fly as we go whilst we're still alive. You know, it used to be that we'd say evolution happens when we pass on genetic data through reproduction, but we can be constantly updating the way that we see the world moment by moment. So story is a kind of software, and story is incredibly important. And if story is really important, then the way that we publish our stories is equally important. I've just realized I've got a clicker. No, don't do that. How do I get how do I get my actual presentation on the screen? Nobody knows. I'm going to continue anyway. So as a storyteller, something that's been driving me has been when I want to release my stories, when I want to put my work out into the world, including a book that I'm releasing later this year, I started to think, well, what is a book? And the basic definition of a book is that it's a document where the pages are glued together. Well, what does the glue of the blockchain facilitate? In what ways can we rethink what a book is when we look at a book in that way? We'll come back to that in a second. First things first, though, literature has an originals problem. If you are into art, then art is a market that's based on trading originals, whereas literature is essentially a market that's based on trading prints. If you wanted to buy a Picasso, then that's going to cost you an awful lot of money, millions, maybe even hundreds of millions of dollars to buy an original Picasso. But if you wanted to buy a first edition of a book as famous as something like The Great Gatsby, then you can get hold of a first edition of The Great Gatsby for a few $1,000s on eBay. Why is that? What's the distinction? Well, the distinction is pretty simple. It's that a first edition isn't an original. It's the offspring of the original, which would have been the book plate that printed the text onto the paper in the first place, or now a digital file. And we don't trade those things. Book plates are cumbersome for starters, and the digital files that we're used to using aren't exactly unique, so we don't have provenance. When we don't have provenance, that means that not only are we not capturing the value of something that's unique, but we don't pass the inherent value down to the prints that we release either. That causes a problem. One of the problems is that in the literary market, if you're an author, then you don't get paid very well. If you are actually an author and genuinely releasing books, there's still only 13% of you that can afford to make that your full-time career. That means that most of the stories in this metaphor of story as software that updates the way we see the world, most of the stories are being told by people who could afford to tell them in the first place. We're not necessarily hearing a lot of different voices. So there's an awful lot of things packaged up in here, and the question that I've been asking myself is, how can the glue of the blockchain help us to tell our stories in new, interesting ways that both benefit the model of storytelling as a whole, but that also benefit the authors that are telling those stories? It's a good job I brought my notebook, isn't it? Okay. One of the ways that we can do that is, I think, to explode the book. So you're going to have to let me paint a picture for you here for a second. We imagine a book as being a single object, whether it's a physical book or whether it's a digital book, a single object. But what I want you to imagine is instead that the technology of the blockchain, the technology of NFTs, allows us to actually unglue that a little bit and explode the book backwards. So we can think of it in terms of the book being the singular document, but then we explode backwards and actually take pages and books as independent economic and software layers. So let's go back to that example of The Great Gatsby. So imagine that The Great Gatsby is a book of 400 pages. Well, then you would have 400 individual pages NFTs, in which the text of every single page is stored on the Ethereum blockchain, which gives it incredible provenance. Historically, that's a wonderful thing. But it also allows it to be treated as a kind of software. It allows text to be treated as a kind of source code and turns story into software, story into code. The next slide was going to be a lovely thing that said maintaining the thread, so that's what the slide was saying, maintaining the thread. I want to imagine now a picture of a tree. A tree has its roots, and then it has the trunk of the tree, and then branches that branch out with all those leaves on them. Imagine that each of those pages was actually the root of that tree, and they powered their way upwards to be the trunk of that tree, which would be the book, out along the branches into the leaves, which could be every single print of that book. The beauty of creating on the blockchain is that you're in a position to maintain the thread between every single one of these assets. So every single leaf that blooms, which is every single print of that book, whether it's digital or physical, is permanently, intimately linked back to the original root. Now, these are small, subtle changes in the framework of the way that we might publish a book, but think of what that means. It means that we're actually reintroducing the book plate back as a tradable item. We're making the pages, the original pages, something that we can actually utilize, we can see. They can accrue value, but we can also use them as this independent software layer. The thing that excites me most about that is this notion of viewing stories as blocks, so breaking large narratives down into their individual component parts. And in doing so, a couple of things happen. We make books into something that, and pages into something that are tradable, frameable, and composable. So I'll just quickly go through those one by one. Tradable in the sense that, remember he said that authors don't earn very much. Well, by separating the economic and software layer of pages and books, you instantaneously create an opportunity for pages to be something that are traded, and therefore an additional economic opportunity for authors to earn more money from their craft. That's a wonderful thing. Frameable in the sense that this isn't a very easy thing to frame and put on display because all the good stuff is inside it. But when you actually separate the pages out from the book and you treat that as a slightly different framework, you can frame those pages. Go back to the Great Gatsby example again. I can't believe for a second that the first page of The Great Gatsby wouldn't be in a museum right now. It's not particularly bothered about that book, but a famous book whose original text can actually be identified and has that provenance. That would be a historical document as well as being worth a lot of money, as well as being framed as art in the same way as the Picasso that we referenced before. We already know this because we've seen the way that organizations like the Verse have been able to reframe poetry as a work of art simply by providing it the provenance that it deserves. So tradable and frameable is wonderful, but composable is perhaps the most interesting part, because when we start to build our pages on a software layer, we make them into NFTs that talk to one another, pages that talk to one another, which means we can start to think in a different way about the way we compose our stories. So many, many, many examples, some of which could be creating a book that has multiple different endings. So maybe you get a random ending for your book of different rarities. You can bring in all of these different traits that we have in other NFT projects. There's a playfulness that we introduce when we take these singular documents and we unglue them and then we put them back together on a framework that's built on software rather than actual glue. That was exciting. I've got 1 minute and 5 seconds left, which is good. So going back to that original point, this idea of narrative is an operating system. This is something that I believe in deeply. If you were listening on that first slide, I really care about storytelling. I do believe that it's very important. I think that life as a whole is an information framework, and one of the ways that it becomes more cohesive over time is that we talk to one another. And the way that we publish our stories is very important. We're going to hear about, the last panel was really, really interesting, very exciting things going on. This, the stuff I'm talking about isn't ChatGPT or AutoGPT and the way that that's going to revolutionize everything. This is a small, subtle change to the way we organize our documents that put us in a position to just do different things. So for me, publishing doesn't need to be changed fundamentally. We don't need to stop having beautiful physical books. What we do need to do, though, is consider a slight update to the infrastructure of publishing that allows us to tell really interesting stories in new ways, allows us to treat story as a kind of software, and in doing so, perhaps allows our authors to be paid a little bit more as well. I am at time. That's exactly at 0 seconds. Thank you very much for listening. That was fun. There we go. That's what I was going to do. Thank you.